Hi guys! So today we're going to go over Unit 6, which is Chapter 22, the respiratory system. And the major overall function of the respiratory system, there are two main functions. The first one, essentially, is to supply the body with oxygen. And this is important because we need cellular respiration. And then from cellular respiration, we get CO2 as a waste product, so we need to dispose of it. So essentially, it's the supply of oxygen and the disposal of CO2. And all of this is because of cellular respiration. Now, the second function, which is very important as well, is for smell and speech. In other words, olfaction, which is smell, and speech. So this is really important. And should explain why we're going to talk about the respiratory system. Now, respiration has 4 processes, and within those, it's subdivided into what's called respiratory system and the circulatory system. And the respiratory and circulatory systems are very closely coupled. Now, within here, we have 4 different processes. The first one is pulmonary ventilation, and this is a movement of air into and out of the lungs, aka breathing, right? So movement of air into and out of the lungs. External respiration has to do with the exchange of oxygen and CO2 between the lungs and the blood, right? So exchange of oxygen and CO2 between lungs and blood. So those are between the respiratory system. Now, when we get to the circulatory system, the process of respiration includes transportation, and it's the transportation of oxygen and carbon dioxide in the actual blood. Up here, we were just talking about the exchange of it. Down here, we're talking about actually bringing it to all the different tissues and organs of the body. Now, once we actually get to those tissues, we need to exchange it. So that's what this internal respiration is. Again, in exchange of CO2 and O2 between blood vessels and tissue. So you can see respiration is in both of these, and so this is basically going to be the exchange of those things. Now, this is basically looking at the major respiratory organs here. You can see the upper respiratory organs have to do with the nasal and nasal cavity. Up here, right? You can see that in the nostrils, the external nasal cavity, internal, and you can see the oral cavity there as well. And then you have essentially the pharynx here that allows food and air to go through. And then you have this line. So everything above that is going to be included in the upper respiratory, and anything below it is lower respiratory. So you can see here the larynx, which is otherwise known as the voice box. You can see the trachea, which we know commonly as the windpipe. And then we're going to get into basically, if you look at the bronchi and the branches. So you can see here, the cornea of the trachea is where it kind of divides here, and then that's going to go into essentially here. Once you divide it, you're going to get the bronchus, the left main, and the right main primary is also known, bronchus, and then it further divides into branches. And then on the outside, you're going to have the little pockets that are the alveoli, and the whole thing is the lungs here. Now, the nose is only the external portion of the respiratory system. Everything else is going to be within it, and it has basically 5 main functions. It helps to provide an airway for respiration. It's going to allow to moisten and warm the air that enters. it's going to serve as a resonating chamber for speech. So we're able to talk because of the dynamics that are within the respiratory system. It's going to help filter and clean air that we bring in. And lastly, it helps house the receptors for smell. So that's house olfactory receptors. They're essentially divided into two regions. One is called the external nose, and the other is the nasal cavity. So let's go forth and look at that real quick. And so on here, you can kind of see that we have the nose and the parasinus. So we're going to focus kind of on the external nose. So here you can see the root, is that area that's between the eyebrows, right? And then you have the bridge here at the top of the nose between the eyes. You have the dorsum nasum, and this is essentially this kind of anterior margin here. And then right down further at the end of the nose is the apex. And then where it kind of comes in from the nose right here is the nasofacial angle. You can see at the very top or bottom part of the nose right here, you have the alanasa. And then you have the anterior nares or nostrils. These are also nares that are here, right? And that separates the two is the nasal septum. The philtrum is this area that kind of dips down on the lips. And then this kind of area that's right here on the nose is a alar nasal sulcus, right? And sulcus just always helps to basically come those areas that kind of go in, right? Now, if we're looking at the external nose and we want to take a little bit closer look at the type of cartilage and how it's made up, you can kind of see now where the bridge is in this area, you can see that it's actually, sorry about that, is made of, that's what we know as the frontal bone, and a little bit is, on the top is this frontal bone up here, and then it kind of moves into that area that's a nasal bone. And you talked about that in AMP1. And then you can see on this kind of area that divides here, that's the septal cartilage. The maxillary bone is right on the outside of that. And then you can see that there's a small process that comes from that septal cartilage that comes out here, and that's that lateral process. And a little bit farther here, where you're starting to get closer to that succulus that you have, that's that minor alar cartilage there. On the outside, you're going to get some nice, dense, fibrous connective tissue. And then here on the tips, where you get the apex, and you get that right above the nasal septum, you're going to get the major alar cartilage there. Now, within the nasal cavity, if we want to actually go inside, because we were focusing on the external part of the nose there, when we have that big area, let me go back. It's not showing here. Let's go back here really quick. What we're going to focus on right now is kind of that internal part that we're looking at right there, okay? And so the nose or the nasal cavity is divided by midline, which is called the nasal septum. This nasal septum is essentially formed by septal cartilage. And this is on the anterior part, so towards the front, right? And at the back, you might remember looking when we were talking about the perpendicular plate and the vomer. This is, if you remember, the nose kind of, let me draw this kind of thing, and then you had this line, right? And then about halfway up on here was the perpendicular plate. And then the ethmoid bone, basically, when we're looking at it, the vomer, right, on the bottom, was on the bottom, and this continued on back. So that bone that's kind of in the middle, or essentially cartilage, some of it is cartilage and some of it is bone, and that is essentially the nasal septum. Now, the nasal vestibule is the nasal cavity that's superior to the nasals, right? Nostrils. And this is lined with what's called vibrissae, and this is just another fancy word for saying the small hairs. And these guys help to basically filter coarse particles from the air we bring in. Now, the rest of the nasal cavity is lined with a mucous membrane, and it's basically divided into two parts. You have the olfactory mucosa, and this lines the superior region of the nasal cavity, and it has olfactory epithelium. So what is this going to help aid in? You'll be right. It is smell, right? And then you have the respiratory mucosa, and this is essentially where, if you remember when you were talking about tissues last semester, that you get the pseudostratified, ciliated, columnar epithelium. And so this is going to contain those good old goblet cells. And what do goblet cells help make? Yeah, mucin, right? Sorry about that. So the goblet cells help to make mucin. And basically these goblet cells rest on lamina propria. This is a thin layer of loose areolar connective tissue that's kind of underneath that epithelial layer. And it helps basically with providing the necessary moisture and this sticky substance to help catch stuff, right? Now, within this layer, lamina propria, there's actually what we know as seriomucous glands there as well. So they're helping to make additional sticky stuff. It's nasal glands. There are also some serous cells in there too. Why, they're really serious. Now, let me kind of clear some of this off here. So in here, both the seriomucous nasal glands that this area houses contains both mucus-secreting mucus cells and serous cells, right? So essentially what happens is these serous cells secrete like a watery fluid that contains enzymes that are going to help break down foreign substances, right? Fluid with enzymes, right? And both of these, mucus and serous secretions, so it doesn't matter where they come, the enzyme that you're going to find there is basically lysozyme and defensin. And so those are going to help basically break down things or proteins or anything that we essentially want to get rid of. Now, the ciliated cells that we were talking about up here, right? Those ciliated cells are important because they help to sweep that contaminated mucus. They move that mucus to the back of the throat. Right? And so that's important because anything that's there, for instance, if you're breathing in and a bacteria gets in there, basically you're going to start having those secretions containing lysosomes and defensive try to break those things down. But also at the same time, they're pushing them so that they can go into your digestive system so that they can't stick there, multiply, and then infect your respiratory system and make you sick. Now, within this, you're also having, on top of this, like it said, it's important. It helps to warm air. So all the different plexuses that you have of capillaries actually help to warm the air. Because your body, the blood flowing through those are really warm. Your body's keeping it that way. So it's basically as you breathe in, initially it's going to be really cold, and that's going to help that radiant heat come off of there. And then the last thing, you are going to have nerve endings in here. And those nerve endings are going to help you recognize when particles are there so that you'll sneeze and remove them. So that area, they are really doing a lot in there. Now, the nasal concha is basically a scroll-like mucosa-covered projection that protrudes immediately from each lateral wall of the nasal cavity. And you basically have three of these sections. You have superior, middle, and inferior. And you might actually remember those because if you were, again, looking, oh no. If you're looking at your nose and you remember the top was a perpendicular plate, the bottom was a vomer, you would have seen these little things on the side of the nose there, and those are the nasal conchas, right? And so right below those lateral walls, those projections, you'll have the nasal meatus. And that essentially is just this groove that's inferior to each one of those. And the shape of these guys helps to do two things. They increase mucosal area, and they help to enhance the air turbulence in there to keep things moving. So the shapes help for that. Now the overall function of the concha is when we breathe in, inhalation, right? So what we have here is during inhalation, both the concha and the nasal mucosa would help to filter heat and moisten air. And during exhalation, or you're breathing out, right? It helps to reclaim heat and moisture. There's no 3 there. So those are essentially the main two functions of these two parts right inside the nasal cavity. Now, after this, you have the paranasal sinuses. These form these ring structures around the nasal cavity. They're located in the frontal, the sphenoid, the ethmoid, and the maxillary bones. And if you remember that back from last semester, and they have three main functions. Because they're kind of these openings that are there, they help to lighten the skull. Not as heavy to carry around. They help for the secretion of mucus, and they help with warming air. And we're going to look at all this here in a second so that you can actually see where everything is here. So that's the most important reasons or the functions between or the paranasal sinuses there. So if we look here, let's actually look at the cavities a little bit and see what we're looking. And this is a sideways view, right? So here's the nostril where the air comes in. And this area that's right at the beginning is that nasal vestibule that we talked about initially. And in that, remember, that area was just superior of the nostrils, right? And it's basically lined with those olfactory mucosas there, again, that contains olfactory epithelium, which helps the smell, and that thin layer of pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelial that contains the goblet cells for mucus, and they rest and they basically help to contain all those glands to kind of moisten things up. On top of that, you know, they have secretions that'll come out of there to essentially protect you from anything that might be trying to get into the system. And then if you go a little bit farther, you can come back here. We're looking at this whole kind of nasal cavity area. And then if you look, here's the nasal cavity, and they're looking specifically at those conchas. So those are those areas that kind of come out. And if you remember on the skull, you could kind of see them protruding out a little bit, right? And so you can see, and so those are these areas right here that are actually protruding. If you look at the indentions that are between the conchas, that's the meatus, right? And that essentially was there if you remember that kind of increases that mucosal area, helps to keep the air turbulent, and then essentially they're going to function to allow filtering heat, moistening air, and reclaim heat and moisture. So those are essentially the main area there, and we're going to kind of look. Here's the cribriform plate that they're talking about, and if you look over here, these are all the different cartilages in the nose. So let's go ahead and move on and check out a little bit and go on to the next part, which we're going to go into the pharynx region. So the pharynx, if you look here, is just kind of this funneled shape thing. That's funnel-shaped muscular tube that runs from the base of the skull to about vertebrae C6, right? That's in the first set of cervical vertebrae, right? This is going to help us to essentially connect the nasal cavity and mouth to the larynx or voice box and esophagus, right? It's composed of skeletal muscles, and there are essentially three regions in this guy. We have the top part here, right, which is the nasopharynx, this middle part, which is the oropharynx, and the laryngeal pharynx, which is closer down by the larynx. Now let's talk about each one of these and the importance of each type, right? So the nasopharynx, that first part, basically has the air that gives it a passageway to the posterior to the nasal cavity. The cell types that you get here, it's basically lined with pseudostratified, columnar epithelium tissue. Now, in this area, you essentially will get both the soft palate and basically the uvula, those, right, same thing. And essentially what they help to do is they'll close, or this area kind of closes during swallowing. To kind of help pressure and get things down, right? Within this area, you also have the pharyngeal tonsils or adenoids. And another structure that you have is the pharyngotympanic tubes, which are the auditory tubes. And these drain and basically help to equal out pressure. So you might think of them as the stationary tubes. I'm going to put equal pressure ears. The oropharynx is basically the passageway for food and air from level of soft palate to the epiglottis, right? And so in here, instead of the pseudostratified epithelial tissue, we actually have stratified squamous. And the other structures that we have, the isthmus of the facies, and this is the opening to oral cavity. You have the palatine tonsils. And you have the lingual tonsils in this area. And the laryngeal pharynx is a passageway for food and air right before it separates out, right? And so here you have the same thing. You have the stratified squamous again. I'm going to write it all down, right? And this guy actually extends to the larynx. And it's continuous with the esophagus. So those are the three main regions of the pharynx. And so here you can kind of get a little bit better idea. I just wrote it all down, right? But let's actually take a look at this and kind of get an idea. So here, right, you have this top part here, you have the nasopharynx here, and so you'll see the pharyngeal tonsils or the adenoids right here, and this is the opening of the tubes that help with draining the ear and stabilizing the ear, right? And then if you go a little bit farther down, right, you'll have that oropharynx, and so here you can see that palatine tonsil right here, the isthmus of the fauces, which is that opening right there to the back of the mouth, right? And essentially you have this other lingual tonsil here. And then you have this last area down here is laryngeal pharynx. And essentially this is the area that's going to extend into the larynx. You can see here, right here is the esophagus. Up here is the larynx, and you can see all the different areas. For instance, this is the flap. We're going to talk about the epiglottis, the vestibular folds, and everything in here that has to do with the vocal cords and making sound for speech. So the problem with this is Essentially, if you get any kind of infected and swollen adenoids, it can actually block the air passage through the nasal pharynx. And it makes that, if that happens, that's the reason why you end up having to breathe in and out of your mouth. And so if you're breathing in and out of your mouth, you're not able to do a few things. You're not able to properly moisten the air, warm it, or filter it before it reaches your lungs. So you're more likely to get infections. When these are chronically enlarged, they can cause speech and sleep disturbances.